Today's video is brought to you by Wondrium, which is helping you sate your curiosity about, well, everything. It's where you go to find the answers to literally everything you've wanted to learn about, and maybe even some stuff that you didn't even think about learning about. And when I say everything, I mean it. There's Ivy League professors basically handing out an expert education in classical Greco-Roman history or philosophy or astronomy. There's also brilliant tutorials, travel logs, long-form explorations, documentaries. It really does seem never-ending. Obviously, if you've watched any of my channels, then you could probably guess that I do see myself as a lifelong learner, and that's at the heart of why I love Wondrium. There's always new stuff to explore or challenges to master. An empty afternoon or a slow weekend is the perfect chance to dive into a new section of content and learn something that you'd never even thought about learning before. And like any top video service in 2022, you can enjoy Wondrium from just about anywhere, on any screen, at any time. I always try to provide recommendations for some of Wondrium's great content, and with Halloween just a few weeks ago, why not check out Monsters Within? It examines the influence of horror in psychological film thrillers and Victorian novels. Or if that's not your thing, you could check out their 48-part lecture on ancient Mesoamerica, a topic which we've covered on this channel several times. Look, the bottom line is this: if you're curious by nature, then head over to Wondrium. And right now, you guys can go to wondrium.com/sideprojects for a free trial to check it out. Again, that's wondrium.com/sideprojects, or just click on the link in the description below to start your free trial today. I highly recommend it, either as a gift for you or a fellow fact lover in your life. And now, today's video. One day, nearly 5 centuries ago, a small Chinese sailing vessel drifted into the shallow waters off the coast of the Japanese island of Tanegashima. On board the ship were 3 Portuguese traders. They would be the first Europeans to ever set foot on the islands of Japan. While we know little about what those 3 traders learned, we can be reasonably certain they picked up at least one useful Japanese phrase: nan tekotta. Loosely translated, that means, what the actual Since then, the West has asked that same question over and over and over again when it comes to the Japanese. Their art, their technology, their food, and their customs have enthralled Westerners and made us ask. That's why today we're going to be demystifying 5 strange Japanese weapons that will make you ask the same. We're not talking about your grandpa's old boring nunchucks and katana here. We're covering 5 delightfully weird Japanese weapons that most people haven't even heard of. From the ancient to the all too modern, here are 5 strange Japanese weapons that prove Japan is number 1 when it comes to WTF. Fans of the famous Marvel mutant Wolverine know that the character of Logan draws inspiration from the near-mythic warrior class of Ronin, the masterless samurai warrior who wanders the earth in search of peace and justice. His code? Bushido, the way of the warrior. What many people don't know is that the Wolverine's abilities themselves also have roots in Japanese traditions. Meet the Tekko family of weapons. Slashing, clawing weapons held in the hands or on the fingers or wrist, designed to be used as a last resort or as part of a sneak attack. Translated literally as backhand hooks, Tekko Kagai are the most evocative of the Wolverine's famous metal claws. But of course, real-life Tekko weapons are diverse, ranging from the Kakute, long, wicked sharp cat's claws, to the Kakute, rings with sharp stilettos worn on the insides of the thumb and the middle finger, designed to allow the user to grab the limbs of his opponent and stop him from wriggling free. Beastly-looking implements are really more of a last resort, designed to give the user an opportunity to disarm or blind an opponent in close quarters, where a knife or sword are either not available or have already been lost. Being attached to the body, the Tekko weapons are available when all else may have already failed. They may also have been used by ninja assassins, a class of highly trained mercenaries who rose to prominence in the 15th century in a period of civil wars that roiled Japan as the shoguns, feudal warlords, battled each other for supremacy. The ninjas, in contrast with the honor-obsessed feudal lords, the samurai, were cunning practitioners of so-called unconventional warfare, part of what later came to be known as ninjutsu. While these practices would, in later centuries, become a well-rounded discipline, they really began as practical tradecraft taught by spy masters in special schools at the behest of violent warlords who wish to use assassin spies to attack their enemies or carry out espionage. The first schools known to teach the art of unconventional warfare were established in the Iga province of southern Japan, and this is where many of the Tekko weapons were perfected. Valued above all for their silence and stealth, Tekko weapons were prized by ninjas who often boasted that they could kill a man 100 times before he ever hit the ground. With these weapons, we certainly believe that possible. The special No. 3 light tank, known simply as the Kuru, was part of an experimental program of the Imperial Japanese Army in 1943, which had the task of devising a new kind of flying light tank. The Japanese war in the Pacific was one of island hopping, as the Japanese Imperial Navy battled for supremacy on the high seas with the US and British navies. At its height, Japan's seafaring empire spanned an area larger than Nazi Germany at the height of its power, and most of that area wasn't land. It was water. A huge element of the Empire of Japan's success in the early stages of the war was its ability to project air power across the Pacific. Its superior air-to-sea weaponry and tactics won Japan early successes in the Pacific War, surprising the American Navy with a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and then going on to capture British Burma, Guam, and Wake Island. As the American and British navies gathered strength, however, in 1943 to 1944, the Japanese had a new problem. While they controlled dozens of atolls and islands between Hawaii, Australia, and the Japanese home islands, they quickly found the Allies, chiefly the American Marine Corps, to be better equipped and better trained for amphibious operations. Meanwhile, the Americans quickly gained ground in the air war, and the Japanese soon suffered humiliating losses in Papua New Guinea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. The problem was one of simple numbers. The Japanese were outnumbered and outgunned on the ground, and the American Navy was growing unstoppably. It was believed then that a new form of air-to-ground armor was needed, one that could allow the Japanese Navy to quickly deploy armor onto remote islands to defend or retake airfields in the Pacific. Enter the Kuru. Based initially on the successful design of the Type 98 Kini light tank, the Kuru was a fitting reflection of the grim reality of Imperial Japan's situation in 1943 to 1944. With steel in constant short supply and most domestic production being reserved for naval and air weaponry, the Kuru was plagued with compromises from the very beginning. Designed to be light enough to fit onto existing glider designs, the tank weighed just under 3 tons, but in order to do so, it sacrificed both arms and armor. Fitted with only one 37mm tank gun, a machine gun, and a flamethrower, and lightly armored in comparison with the deadlier American M1 Abrams, the Kuru did not even have a dedicated gunner. The commander was expected to guide the tank as well as operate its gun and to load it. As if these problems weren't enough, the little tank that couldn't had another crippling flaw. It was slow. So slow, in fact, that tests proved that its tracks would be heavily damaged in the process of taking off from either a carrier or ground runway. The Kuru was dead on arrival before it ever once took to the sky. With vastly superior American Sherman tanks entering the fray, the age of lightly armored and maneuverable tanklets was drawing to an end, and amphibious warfare, exactly the style of fighting the Japanese had not perfected, was becoming the norm. It may be just as well. By 1944, Japan had begun to lose air superiority in the Pacific and had turned to the suicidal strategy of fighting the invaders to the very last man. Had this tank seen any action in the Pacific, it's likely it wouldn't have lasted long against superior American armor. Tony Robbins once said, "In life, you either need inspiration or desperation." Surely, in the case of the Kiten, desperation was the operative motivator. As unthinkable as an advanced military using suicide bombing tactics may be today, by late 1943, the Japanese Empire was desperate. In its desperation, it turned to one of its ancient traditions, the suicide attack, forming special attack units that are called Tokotai. The mission of these Tokotai was grim: destruction at any cost, including of the soldier himself. What must be understood is that at the time, the Japanese people were convinced that the sins they had committed in building their empire were coming home to roost. Despite American and European protestations and pledges to peacefully rebuild a democratic Japan, the average Japanese soldier had been told that the American devils meant to kill every Japanese civilians and wipe Japan from the map. This dire fear of reprisals made suicide attacks seem justified to Japanese soldiers who were told that the only way to save their people from total destruction was to show the Allied forces that the cost of taking Japan in a siege would be utterly catastrophic. Japanese high command glorified the code of Bushido, particularly the tradition of honorable suicide and kamikaze suicide attacks. While you may have heard of the kamikaze airplanes or divine wind and the bonsai charges of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, you may not have known that the Japanese also built and deployed suicide torpedoes, tiny one-man submarines whose role was to strike at the heart of the American fleet at sea. The Kiten, or Heaven Shaker, was a large ship-borne Japanese Type 93 torpedo with the guidance system removed and replaced with the smartest guidance computer then available, a human being. Early versions designed in 1943 made provisions for the pilot who guided the torpedo using a periscope to escape. However, the final designs were deployed with the hatches welded shut behind the pilot, making escape at sea impossible. To make matters worse for the hapless suicides mariner, most Kiten were also deployed with self-destruct mechanisms on board, meaning that the torpedo would explode after its fuel was exhausted, whether or not it found its target. Thankfully, only 100 Kiten were ever deployed, as the program encountered many technical problems. The torpedoes were difficult to control, and their pilots, boys 17, 18 years old, who were facing death at the completion of their mission, suffered from terrible morale. Obviously. While versions were developed for deployment on land and from the air, only submarine-borne Kiten were ever used. Yet even these were hardly foolproof. It's believed that the Kiten sank more Japanese ships than American ones. It turns out that steaming towards an objective with 5 rather large bombs strapped to the outside of your hull makes your attack submarine highly vulnerable to depth charges and other misadventures. Having suicide charges on board every one of them also doesn't help, as it turns out. The Kiten's first and only successful use case came on November 20th, 1944 in Micronesia, where 5 Kitens were launched against an oil tanker, the USS Mississauga. Only one found its mark, but the explosion was so impressive that the Japanese submarine commander would boast to his superiors that 3 aircraft carriers had been destroyed in the attack. This prompted Naval Command to order the deployment of even more Kiten and to employ them in later conflicts off the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. None were successful in sinking Allied ships ever again. In yet another case of fate-loving irony, the Kiten turned out to be a terrible weapon. Plagued with technical problems and low morale, the Kiten program took reasonably effective Japanese torpedoes and turned them into useless underwater suicide bombs. It's believed by historians today that the Japanese would have found more success if they'd simply used traditional torpedoes. The Kiten turned out to be nothing more than a sad case of desperation driving poor decisions from military leaders. Of course, for every catastrophically bad weapon they've produced, Japanese inventors throughout history have supplied at least one ingeniously devious counterexample. And so it is with the earlier mentioned Kakute, also known as the death ring. Designed to be concealed by the wearer on the inside of the palm and not to be worn on the outside of the fist, as may seem logical, the death ring is a dastardly weapon favored by medieval ninja assassins who used the rings dipped in poison or as an aid in quickly cutting the throat, or indeed to quickly gouge out the eyes of anyone unlucky enough to turn their back on a killer wearing a pair of these rings. Dating since at least the advent of ninja schools in the 15th century, legend has it that these deadly rings were favored by the femme fatales of the ninja world, the so-called kunoichi, or lady ninjas. While modern scholars of ninja history, and thank God for the existence of that coolest of all specializations among historians, they argue that there is no solid evidence that lady ninjas have ever been widespread in Japan. Still, though, they remain a fixture in modern historical fiction. The Kakute, at least on paper, is a lady ninja's best friend in a pinch. Kakute, it should be noted, are not just used to claw the eyes out of an unsuspecting opponent. Versions with small protruding hooks or rings in them may be used for the ancient art of hojojutsu, a technique of using ropes to subdue an opponent non-lethally. The ropes can be threaded through the Kakute, allowing the practitioner to gain the advantage of an opponent and quickly tie them in place. Useful if a ninja's mission is espionage or theft rather than assassination. It's been nearly 8 decades now since the last shots of the Second World War were fired. Yet it's virtually certain that the last victims of this conflict are still alive and well to this day. That's because thousands of tons of unexploded munitions, anything from 750-pound bombs to mortar shells to anti-personnel mines, remain a dangerous threat in the 21st century. It may not surprise you then to learn that despite most of these munitions being found in Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, France, and the former Soviet Union, there remain potential victims even in the United States. No, Japanese strategic bombers never reached the shores of the United States, but yet the devastating legacy of the so-called Fugo, or vengeful wind, is still very real. The Fugo, known by American historians as the balloon bomb, are a class of incendiary balloon weapons unleashed from Japan in the latter stages of World War II. Launched in large part between November 1944 and April 1945, these nearly 10,000 hydrogen balloons each carried a 12-kilogram incendiary explosive device intended to wreak havoc not on American cities, but on her natural wonders. That's right, developed in the infamous Noborito laboratory by a Lieutenant General Araikichi Tada beginning in 1933, the Fugo was imagined as a strike against the natural resources of an enemy nation, a revenge weapon meant to rob the Americans of their national wealth and heritage. Meant to be carried across the sea on currents of air, falling in the wilderness and forests of North America, the Fugo would spark forest fires, destroy crops, and just generally cause terror and confusion among Japan's enemies. While their strategic purpose was questionable at best, the bombs themselves were of an ingenious design. Onboard altitude control was achieved with a sort of analog computer run by an aneroid barometer, and the balloons were capable of dropping ballast and crudely navigating themselves across the ocean to strike at targets thousands of kilometers away. First achieving and then maintaining an altitude of some 10,000 meters, the balloons would ride the jet stream air current, moving at up to 320 kilometers per hour. That would direct them to the United States mainland within 30 to 100 hours of release. While these devilishly clever bombs were originally intended to be launched from submarines standing within about 1,000 kilometers of the American coast, fortunately for America's many national forests, these attacks never went forward, and most of the thousands of balloons were released from sites in the Ibaraki prefecture on Japan's mainland. Still, though, about 200 balloons were launched per day during the height of the Fugo program, using hydrogen made on site. Occasional tracker balloons were also launched along with the live ordnance balloons to track the progress of the balloon fleet across the ocean by radio. Surprisingly, for such a technologically ambitious program, it kind of worked. Balloons were found to have detonated over the United States and Canada, with remains of balloons and their contents found in over 25 states and provinces, mostly in the western half of North America. The balloons even scored something of a miracle shot, landing on and temporarily disabling the high-power electrical lines in Toppenish, Washington. These very same high-power lines have been supplying the Manhattan Project's production facility at Hanford Engineer Works. However, backup generators kicked in and no damage was done to the project. Plutonium from the Hanford facility would later be used in the nuclear device nicknamed Fat Man to be dropped on Nagasaki less than 6 months later. It's surprising to imagine that the Japanese balloon program very nearly prevented this from occurring, if only temporarily. However, disappointingly for the supervillainesque balloon program mastermind Rikichi Dada, their mission was largely a failure. The American Forest Service responded with a coordinated program to seek out and eliminate the incoming balloons, and the resulting program, called the Lightning Project, went on to form the backbone of the United States' future response to natural disasters. If anything, the attacks only made America's natural resources more secure. Still, on May 5, 1945, 6 civilians would lose their lives in Bly, Oregon, when they happened upon one of the balloon bombs while on a picnic in the Fremont National Forest. A reverend, his pregnant wife, and 4 sons were killed instantly when the strange device detonated as they were examining it, most likely believing it to be a simple weather balloon. Investigators discovered the balloon still lying atop a layer of snow weeks after the surround snow had melted, leading them to conclude that the bomb had been in place for some time before exploding. Those were the only known fatalities caused by these ingenious revenge weapons, but they may not be the last. Since 1945, at least 8 additional devices have been found in North America, with the last one being detonated safely as recently as 2014 by the Royal Canadian Navy in British Columbia. It's entirely possible that unexploded balloon bombs continue to lie in wait, not knowing or caring that the war they were designed to fight ended nearly 80 years ago. And if that's not enough for you to say, Nantakota, well, we really don't know what is.